Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. My name is John Wilhelm, and I will be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, there are a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on the floor at the bottom of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on the documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on documents also on the right. There will be a Q&A during the last 5 minutes of the webinar. To submit your questions, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging, and then Participants, and then type in your question. You can submit participants and then type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time. If you are watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. Just a quick disclaimer to start. Please note that any pictures used in this webinar are not the property of Boost or the presenter, and copyrighted material would need the permission of the owner before reproducing. So now, let's begin our discussion. Thanks so much for joining us today. I was thrilled when Pearl asked me to deliver this webinar. Boost is an organization that I've worked closely with in my role as a manager of social work services in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, where I was employed for just about 30 years. As a school board, we certainly valued the advice, support, and services coordination provided through Pearl and other Boost staff. I have a master's degree in social work from Wilfrid Laurier University and mental health, and particularly mental health supports in educational settings. I'm also a trainer with Living Works, a Canadian-based organization that's developed a number of trainings, including ASSIST, which is applied suicide intervention skills. As you can imagine, working in a rather large school board with close to 100,000 students, we were quite often involved with students who indicated that they had thoughts of suicide. Although clinical judgment plays a significant role in any professional practice, we found it helpful to develop clear guidelines which direct all school staff in responding to a person who has thoughts of suicide. These procedures were based on best evidence, and much of what follows in this webinar form the basis for the development of those guidelines. As you know, adolescence is certainly a period of vivid change. The journey from child to adult can be complex and challenging. It is common for children and youth to feel in social groups. However, at the same time, they may lack the life experiences that lets them know that difficult situations will not last forever. We now better understand that mental health problems commonly associated with adults, such as depression, also affect young people. Any one of these factors or a combination may become such a source of pain that they seek relief in suicide. In Canada, following deaths by... Yes? Yes? I can. So stop sharing your screen. No, it's just the camera. There. Okay. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Hopefully that's better. So in Canada, following deaths by motor vehicle accidents, suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. Yet, guilt or shame that surrounds suicide. Quite simply, people may be uncomfortable discussing suicide. Unfortunately, this tradition of silence perpetuates harmful myths and attitudes. It can also prevent people from talking openly about the pain they feel or the help they need. In a 2015 survey administered by the Offord Centre for Child Studies of more than 31,000 Ontario students who were surveyed, 11% of students reported needing professional help for mental health concerns. Of these students, 54% received professional help, while the other 46% did not. The report concluded that students are more likely to report they need help if they attend a secondary school compared to elementary, identify as female, and come from a family at socioeconomic risk. Of those students surveyed, 44% indicated economic risk. Of those students surveyed, 44% indicated that they would seek help at school. The most common reasons students report that they would not seek help at school are that they prefer to handle the problem themselves, they don't know who to approach at school, or they are worried that other people would find out. Suicide prevention is everyone's responsibility. No single discipline or level of societal organization is solely responsible for suicide prevention. Individuals in many roles and at all levels of community and government can and should contribute to the prevention of suicide-related behaviors. Suicide prevention therefore requires collaboration based on equality, where no discipline or stakeholder is privileged over another. Throughout this webinar, you will likely hear me refer to networks of support, building that they have someone to turn to during periods of vulnerability. Not everyone will need access to professional supports all the time. However, some people will require hospitalization to ensure their safety. Working with a person at risk to determine who can be involved in their network of support can lead to a powerful safety net. However, it's also important to keep in mind that you can't always go along with everything that person who has thoughts of suicide would like. We'll talk further about this. Open and honest discussion and communication is the first essential step in assisting youth at risk of suicide. Learning the facts of suicide can be a difficult subject. Here are some of the myths about suicide. Myth: young people rarely think about suicide. Reality: many teens and youth think about suicide at one time in their life. In a survey of 15,000 grade 7 to 12 students in British Columbia, 34% knew of someone who had attempted or died by suicide. 16% had considered suicide. 14% had made a suicide plan at one time in their life. 7% had made an attempt, and 2% had required medical attention due to an attempt. Myth: talking about suicide will give a young person the idea or permission to consider suicide as a solution to their problems. Reality: talking about suicide without showing fear or making judgments can bring relief to someone who is feeling terribly isolated. A willingness to listen shows sincere concern. Encouraging someone to speak about their suicidal feelings can reduce the risk of an attempt. Myth: suicide is sudden and unpredictable. Suicide is most often a process, not an event. 8 out of 10 people who died by suicide gave some or even many indications of their intentions. Myth: suicidal youth are seeking attention or trying to manipulate others. Realities: efforts to manipulate or grab attention are always a cause for concern. All suicide threats should be taken seriously. Myth: a suicidal person will always be at risk. In reality, many people have some thoughts of suicide at some time in their life. The overwhelming desire to escape from pain can be relieved when the problem or pressure is also relieved. learning effective coping techniques to deal with stressful situations can help. During this 1 hour, so important. Historically, when speaking about suicide, we've used terms that have had an unintentional negative impact on persons who have thoughts of suicide. Outdated language can have the unintended impact of silencing people. Data regarding suicide rates can seem discouraging, yet it's important to understand and analyze trends in an effort to help determine how best to position our supports. When professional support systems are only available during weekday business hours, they're less likely to be responsive to the needs of the community. Risk factors refer to that increase the likelihood that a child will experience emotional challenges. Risk factors are different for each individual. If a child or teen has risk factors, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will automatically have mental health struggles, but it does mean that it is even more important to build their resilience through strong relationships. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will automatically have mental health struggles, but it does mean that it is even more important to build their resilience through strong relationships, a healthy lifestyle, and healthy coping strategies for managing stress and negative emotions. We often refer to these latter things as protective factors. There is an abundance of potential protective factors, and once again, the combination of these protective factors will work best to help guard someone from acting upon their thoughts of suicide. Furthermore, we will discuss the strong importance of involving a person at risk in determining their own combination of protective factors that will form their individual safety net. When you think of a warning sign on the road, you likely envision a type of sign which indicates a potential hazard, obstacle, or condition requiring special attention. Warning signs of suicide are similar. Imagine speaking to a friend at a coffee shop and your friend mentions that they feel like life is sometimes not worth living. Like a road sign, it's wise not to ignore such a warning sign. Rather, we want to pay attention to the meaning of that sign, unpack it, and explore. We will discuss various types of supports, both formalized and informal supports, and again, the importance of involving the person at risk. I will briefly touch upon tips for parents in speaking to their children and how they might respond when they suspect or learn that their child has thoughts of suicide. I will highlight just a few evidence-based counseling approaches, being careful not to infer that these are the only effective interventions. Finally, we'll talk very briefly about resources. Language is important, and understanding of some clear definitions may help to ensure that we are on the same page during this webinar. Much more importantly, using terminology that encourages people to speak about suicide is important. Some terms have the unintentional consequence of adding to stigma and even shaming a person who has thoughts of suicide. Outdated terminology is akin to outdated laws. Until 1972, attempting suicide was part of our criminal code. The intention was to mandate treatment and confine people in order to keep them safe. However, more often the impact was that people would not talk about their plans for suicide, or certainly not about previous attempts of suicide, in fear that they might be criminalized. The term suicide can be defined as death caused by self-directed, injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior. A suicide attempt can be defined as a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior, which may or may not result in injury, with any intent to die as a result of that behavior. And suicidal ideation can be defined as thoughts of suicide that can range in severity from a vague wish to die to active suicidal ideation with a specific plan and intent. When talking about suicide, I would invite you to consider the following language, which is based on feedback provided by people who have experienced suicidal thoughts and attempts. Consider using the term died by suicide or suicided, rather than committed suicide. The term committed and completed suicide should be avoided, as people who survive a suicide attempt may feel that by being alive they are incomplete or they have not completed something. A failed attempt might cause someone to feel that they are a failure and can't even kill themselves. Or a successful attempt may suggest that the death was positive. Again, the terms suicided or died by suicide are simple and preferred. The following three charts were taken from www.crisistextline.org, which is a free text line that is available 24/7 for people in crisis. Although this organization is based in the United States, the text line is available in Canada in conjunction with Kids Help Phone by texting 686868. If you text this number, you will get Help Phone by texting 686868. If you text this number, you will see a message that reads, "Welcome to the crisis text line powered by Kids Help Phone. Terms and privacy notes can be found at kidshelpphone.ca, and then data rates may apply for links. Text stop to cancel. You'll text with a trained crisis responder. We can't receive messages greater than 160 characters." And then it states, "No one sees your number unless you're in danger. What's on your mind?" Then following initial text, the texter receives the message, "Thanks for sharing. We're getting a crisis responder for you. It may take a moment." And my experience with the text line is that it takes a very short moment. They're very responsive. In this diagram, texters who were in suicide also experienced these other issues in the same conversation. For example, of those whose text included thoughts of suicide, that they had thoughts of suicide, 43.5% of those people also indicated depression or sadness in their text messages. Any issues that has been tagged here is certainly of significance. Of all those whose text included thoughts of suicide, 3.3% also mentioned emotional abuse, 2.7% mentioned sexual abuse, and 2.4% mentioned physical abuse. Percentage of total volume of texts received differentiated by day of week. As we can see, the number of texts received is quite evenly distributed throughout each of the days of the week. In fact, the greatest variance in texts received is only 2% from the most commonly used day to the least commonly used day. This provides some food for thought about the availability of resources during the entire course of the week. This is not to suggest that all mental health organizations should be available for 7 days a week. Rather, it speaks to the need for system coordination to ensure that adequate supports are available throughout the week and not simply during weekdays. It also speaks to the importance of developing a network of supports that are varied in nature and can be available at different times for the person at risk. Similarly, this chart indicates the percentage of total volume distributed by 2-hour intervals throughout the day. As can be seen, the greatest percentage of texts are received after 6 p.m. and before 4 a.m., speaking to the need for crisis support when other forms of service are not typically available. Mental health professionals and mental health organizations should consider providing messages that direct persons to crisis supports when they themselves are not available. For example, a response on a mental health professional's cell phone might say something like, "You've reached the cell phone of John Smith. I'm available for support Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and I'm not monitoring messages at other times. If you are in need of immediate support, please contact Kids Help phone, for example, at 1-800-668-6868, or go to the emergency website, such as we don't provide mental health advice, counseling, or treatment through this website. However, you may contact our office by telephone during business hours. If you or someone you know is in crisis, call 911 or go to the nearest emergency department. You can also reach out to Kids Help Phone and then give the number. Once again, this is an example of helping to build a safety net. As I said, data regarding suicide rates can feel discouraging, but evidence builds awareness and helps us to be vigilant. Today in Canada, it is believed that 10 people will end their lives by suicide, and up to 200 others will attempt to do so. Research shows that there were 3,926 suicides in the year 2016 in Canada. In 2015, over 3 million Canadians aged 12 and over had suicidal thoughts in the year 2016 in Canada. In 2015, over 3 million Canadians aged 12 and over had suicidal thoughts. So to be certain, suicide is a critical public health issue. Not all suicides can be prevented. However, knowing the warning signs of suicide can help us to recognize and respond to thoughts of suicide in a timely manner. We will be talking about warning signs soon. Something to keep in mind that many people have thoughts of suicide, but fewer people ever act upon those thoughts. This data can be encouraging. Our aim can be to support people in their time of crisis in a timely manner so that they recognize alternative solutions to suicidal actions. For each death by suicide, many people will be profoundly affected by suicide loss. Parents, peers, teachers, and others can all be impacted by a death by suicide. It is also important that these people have access to timely and ongoing supports. Even when caregivers are supporting people who are having thoughts of suicide, they frequently need their own access to services. Sometimes disaggregated data can help us to gain a better picture of the issue. For example, there is a difference in the rates of deaths by suicide when comparing those who identify as male and those who identify as female. Females are 3 times more likely to attempt to end their lives, and in addition, females are hospitalized 1.5 times more often than males for suicide-related behaviors. However, males are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than females. This discrepancy is likely related to the different means used by males and females. Males who attempt suicide tend, but not always, tend to use less lethal methods compared to males who tend to use immediately lethal and violent methods. Unfortunately, I could find very little data in reference to other gender definitions, but I did find a study in the US published in January 2019, which examined transgender identity and experiences of violence, victimization, substance use, suicide risk, and sexual risk behaviors among high school students, and significant differences were reported. Population-based survey data from 10 states and 9 urban school districts found that an average of 1.8% of high school students identify as transgender. Transgender students were much more likely than were cisgendered students to report violence, victimization, substance abuse, and suicide risk. So this is my final slide referring to data. In understanding suicide, it may be also helpful to disaggregate the data based on age. When we compare suicide rates between children and youth aged 10 to 19 to those aged 20 to 29 years of age, we can see from this chart that suicide remains the second leading cause of death of youth between both the ages of 10 to 19, as well as those aged 20 to 29 years of age. However, the percentages of males who die by suicide increases with age. Males account for 41% of 10 to 14-year-old suicides, but then the rate of male suicides increases to 70% when the male youth are between the ages of 15 to 19, 20 to 29 years. While 72% of hospitalizations related to self-harm are associated with those who identify as female between the ages of 10 and 19, only 58% of hospitalizations related to self-harm are associated with those who identify as female between the ages of 20 and 29. These figures illustrate the importance of monitoring data, examining that data. They provide insights not only to trends about the means of suicide, but also those who seek help for suicide and at what point in their life. Now, as important as data is, it's also important to note that no two people are the same. People have personal reasons for turning to thoughts of suicide. When speaking with an individual, it is essential to hear the person's individualized story to understand reasons why they may want to die. In hearing their story, you may also gain insights to the reasons that a person wants to story to understand reasons why they may want to die. In hearing their story, you may also gain insights to the reasons that a person wants to live and resources that can help them do so. I'll talk a little bit more about this. Before talking about supports for persons who have thoughts of suicide, I want to touch upon risk factors and protective factors. Quite simply put, risk factors increase the likelihood that a young person will engage in suicidal behavior. Protective factors can mitigate risk. Risk factors can be categorized into health-related issues, interpersonal factors, social or situational factors, environmental factors, and historical factors. Protective factors include positive skills, restricted access to means, cultural and religious beliefs, access to interventions, effective care and support. The following list of risk factors is certainly not exhaustive, but rather some of the most common factors related to risk. Typically, more than one risk factor is present with persons who have thoughts of suicide. Even the absence of protective factors is a risk factor in itself. It's not surprising that risk factors can be related to health, especially mental health conditions such as depression, substance use problems, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, personality traits of aggression, mood, and poor relationships. Conduct disorder and anxiety disorders could also be included. Health factors can also include serious physical health conditions, including traumatic brain injury. Interpersonal risk factors include recent or serious loss, mental disorders, as I said, particularly mood disorders, hopelessness, helplessness, guilt, worthlessness, previous suicide attempts, certainly alcohol and other substance abuse disorders, disciplinary problems, high-risk behaviors, and sexual orientation confusion. Social and situational risk factors include recent or serious loss, example, death, divorce, separation, family history of suicide, witnessing family violence, child abuse or neglect, lack of social support, sense of isolation, and victim of bullying. Cultural and environmental risk factors include access to lethal means such as firearms, stigma associated with asking for help, barriers to accessing services, lack of bilingual services, unreliable transportation, financial costs of services, and cultural beliefs. For example, believing that suicide is a noble resolution. Historical risk factors include previous suicide attempts, family history of suicide, child abuse, neglect, or trauma. In fact, according to a study published online in the Journal of Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior, approximately 1/3 of adults who were physically abused in childhood have seriously considered taking their own life, a rate higher than adults who were not physically abused in childhood. A strong association between childhood physical abuse and subsequent suicidal behaviors remained even after taking into account other risk factors, such as adverse childhood conditions, health behaviors, and psychosocial stressors. According to its lead author, Esma Fuller-Thompson, a professor of social work at the University of Toronto, he said, this research provides important clinical implications for healthcare providers, suggesting that we need to screen for suicidal ideation among adults who have experienced childhood physical abuse and highlighting the importance of providing preventative treatment to childhood abuse survivors. As you likely know, protective factors can mitigate risk. Protective factors can be developed and controlled for. Although all protective factors are typically helpful for all people, certain protective factors are essential for some. It's important that when determining which protective factors are best suited to each situations, the individuals at risk of suicide are involved in that decision making. The protective factors become important when establishing a safety plan. Quite simply put, when I say safety plan, I'm referring to those resources, strengths, and actions that can help protect a person from acting upon their thoughts of suicide. Protective factors include, but are certainly not limited to, skills in problem solving, conflict resolution, and handling problems in a nonviolent way, strong connections to family, friends, and community support, restricted access to highly lethal means of suicide, cultural and religious beliefs that encourage suicide and support self-preservation, easy access to a variety of clinical interventions, effective clinical care for mental, physical, and substance abuse disorders, and support through ongoing medical and mental health care relationships. When talking about suicide prevention, mental health professionals often talk about building a person's resilience. Dr. Tayeb Rashad at the University of Toronto, along with others, has done a great deal of work in developing a strength-based resilience program, which is designed to help participants develop resilience. We and colleagues developed the program particularly to support students in their transition from secondary school to post-secondary school. The program invites students to reflect actively on their experiences that demonstrate various aspects of their own personal resilience. By reflecting back on these experiences and engaging in other exercises, participants learn skills and strategies that build their resilience. The program, of course, does not teach writing or mathematics, but it does ask participants to try out new skills and learn who they are as well as who they want to be. People rarely dedicate any structured time to conducting this sort of self-development. However, building resilience is one of the most important skills that a person can actually develop. Dr. Rashad's program helps students to explore how well they know themselves and think about questions like, do you view yourself through a lens of strengths or through a lens of weaknesses? Strengths or through a lens of weaknesses? Which do you value, the traits you have or those that you don't have? Do you know which of your characters help you respond adaptively to challenge? What kinds of supports do you need from your family, friends, and teachers in order to meet various kinds of challenges? What supports you use in the most difficult times? And what do you do to support others who are facing difficult situations? So a warning sign does not automatically mean that a person is going to attempt suicide, but it should be responded to in a serious and thoughtful manner. Don't dismiss the suicidal thought as a simple cry for attention. You might think of a warning sign as a person with thoughts of suicide waving a flag, asking for help. They may be desperate for someone to understand the pain that they are feeling and the desire to find alternative solutions to ending that pain. One of the strongest warning signs is waving a flag, asking for help. They may be desperate for someone to understand the pain that they are feeling and the desire to find alternative solutions to ending that pain. One of the strongest warning signs includes a person who verbalizes that they're thinking about suicide. Sometimes people are very direct and able to tell someone openly that they're having thoughts of suicide. In such situations, persons typically believe that others can and do want to help. They frequently believe that by telling others directly, they will find support. If a person conveys their thoughts of suicide open and directly, it's important that they are then indeed supported, as they believe and hope. It's important that they are taken seriously and not dismissed as a cry for attention or for some other reason. Not everyone who's considering suicide will say so directly, and not everyone who threatens suicide will follow through. However, every threat, sometimes even cryptic. For example, a person who has thoughts of suicide may give away prized possessions. Some people who have given away such prized possessions and then attempted suicide have indicated that it was important for them to be remembered, that they wanted others to possess things that were important to them, and that they hoped that people would even question why they were giving away such items of importance. Before disclosures of suicidal thoughts can be both, because disclosures can be both overt and covert, it's important for caregivers to be persistent and inquisitive when someone talks or behaves in such a way that gives us concern. Of course, we're always relieved to learn that a person may be experiencing distress, but aren't necessarily thinking of suicide. In many cases, suicide can be prevented. Research suggests that the best way to prevent suicide is to know the risk factors and warning signs and then act. I've already outlined the risk factors. However, I also want to highlight that changes are something to pay close attention to. Some of these changes involved a change in personality, which can include becoming sad, withdrawn, irritable, tired, indecisive, or apathetic. Also, suddenly becoming calm after a period of depression or moodiness can be a sign that the person has made a decision to end their life. A change in behavior, which can include difficulty concentrating at school or routine tasks, potentially dangerous behavior such as reckless driving, engaging in unsafe sex, and increased use of drugs or alcohol might be an indicator. A change in sleep patterns, which can include insomnia, often with early waking or oversleeping, and nightmares can be reason for include a loss of appetite or weight or overeating. In addition, this person might suddenly become less concerned about his or her appearance. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list, nor do any one of these warning signs in themselves automatically mean that a person is having thoughts of suicide, of course. Again, if you're concerned that someone might have thoughts of suicide, become inquisitive, ask questions. If you suspect that someone might be having thoughts of suicide, the most direct method to be certain is just to ask directly. Most likely, the person will understand that you're coming from a caring place, and they will appreciate your intention to help. Keep in mind that most people who have thoughts of suicide actually don't want to die. However, they can't live with the pain that they are feeling, and they do not see any other resolution. If you are involved, they are likely looking for help in finding alternatives to ending their pain. Think about it. In most situations, people who have expressed their thoughts of suicide in whatever direct or indirect ways are likely looking for help. People who have thoughts of suicide are most often ambivalent. Although part of them wants to die, that's true and real, a part of them also likely wants to live. It is this life-providing force that helps to keep people alive and can give them access to the strength and resources that are needed to live. Often, they need to find ways to escape from their pain and may be looking for ways other than suicide to do so. So imagine this. Imagine I was buying a house. Maybe I want to purchase a century-old home in an area of the city that I've always dreamed of living. I make an offer, it's except I was buying a house. Maybe I want to purchase a century-old home in an area of the city that I've always dreamed of living. I make an offer, it's accepted, and I'm about to sign the agreement when my phone rings. It's my home inspector. My home inspector says, I found a crack in the foundation, and the roof is leaking, and the electrical wiring is outdated. It's going to need to be replaced. So what do? I love this home, but hearing this news makes me uncertain. I'm no longer sure that I want to buy that house. So I hesitate, and I pause. I try to think of things through a little bit more thoroughly. You can be that lifeline for a person who has thoughts of suicide. You can listen to their reasons for dying, and you can acting. They can choose to accept support. This wordle, as illustrated by the crisis text line, indicates the most common words written by those who also suggested that they no longer wish to live. Take a minute to read through this wordle. While all words are open to interpretation, there seems to be a pull between both negative and positivity. You can see the pull between life and death in these wordles. Both the word never and always are mentioned. Both the word bad and good are commonly mentioned. Both nothing and good are commonly mentioned. Both nothing and everything are used frequently. Helping someone to understand both their feelings about death and their feelings about life can provide a perspective leading to a positive mindset where the person is willing to get further support. People who are having thoughts of suicide might feel like they have no purpose in life, have no reason for living. They may feel trapped or like there's no way out of their situation. They may feel hopeless about the future or that life will never get better. They may feel that they're a burden to someone. These are all difficult subjects to talk about, and you might feel quite uncomfortable talking about such problematic areas. This is entirely normal and understandable. It might help to let them know that you care about them and that they're not alone. You could say something like, I can't imagine how painful this is. I'd like to try to understand. Repeating their words in their own words shows that you're listening. In many situations, people want and need someone to listen to them. My grandmother always used to say, if we were meant to talk more and listen less, we'd have two mouths and one ear. Listening is an essential element of supporting someone who may have thoughts of suicide. However, for persons who have thoughts of suicide and could potentially act upon those thoughts, listening is not enough in itself. Whenever you think a person might have thoughts of suicide, it's important to ask the person directly and clearly. Asking a person if they have thoughts of suicide will be like opening a conversation. It will demonstrate to the person at risk that you care. It will also likely convey that you have the courage and fortitude to talk about suicide. It is important for the person who has thoughts of suicide to know that there are people. It is important for the person who has thoughts of suicide to know that there are people who care and want to provide help. Think about what may happen if you ask someone indirectly, such as, you aren't thinking about hurting yourself, are you? The person at risk may feel as though you are being judgmental. They may sense that you're uncomfortable with talking about suicide and that you might be hoping to avoid the discussion. They may respond in a vague manner that leaves you wondering if they still have thoughts of suicide. Some people believe that mentioning suicide might cause someone to consider suicide for the first time. This is simply not true. So don't be afraid of this outcome. You're much more likely to help someone feel less alone if they were considering suicide if you ask directly. And asking directly does not need to be complicated. You can say things like, are you having thoughts of suicide? Or, are you thinking about killing yourself? Sometimes I find normalizing the conversation can be helpful. So you might say something like, sometimes when people talk about feeling hopeless or that life is pointless, they are having thoughts of suicide. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Ask if they have a plan. Ask if they have means. Ask if they have a time frame. Never leave the person alone. Listen non-judgmentally. If you believe that the person is not in crisis that needs immediate attention, you can engage them in a conversation to see how they are feeling and how long they have been feeling this way. Listen in a kind and respectful way so that the person feels comfortable to talk openly without being judged. Ask about their reasons for living and their reasons for dying. Try to explore the reasons for some getting through the day rather than focusing too far on the future, and support them in getting professional help. Follow up to any commitments that you agree to. While it is helpful for the person who has thoughts of suicide to direct their own safety plan, you may not be able to go along with everything that they suggest. You may need to involve others, even if the person who has thoughts of suicide doesn't want you to do so. As well, it's important to get support for yourself. Remember that you don't need to find an answer or even to completely understand why a person may be having thoughts of suicide. Listening to what they have to say will at least let them know you care. Let the person know you are concerned and willing to help. Offering the person kindness and attention and letting them know you are willing to help find the support they need and then carry through with that. Often, let the person know you are concerned and willing to help. Offering the person kindness and attention and letting them know you are willing to help find the support they need and then carry through with that. Often, the other person will have their own resources for professional help, such as a community leader, a therapist, a physician, or a family member. And then always remember, if you are concerned for the person's immediate safety, call 911. When talking to children about youth about suicide, there are some do's and don'ts that might be helpful. So some of those don'ts are, and these are tips for parents primarily, don't ask why. This encourages defensiveness. Don't act shocked. This will put a distance between you. Don't debate whether suicide is right or wrong, or feelings are good or bad. Don't lecture on the value of life. I guess those aren't just good for parents, but mind. Remind them that you love them and care for them. Convey how important they are to you. Focus on concern for their well-being. Make statements that you have empathy for their stress. Refer. Help them seek professional help. When talking to your own children about suicide, I think there's 3 things you should keep in mind. First, try to establish open and honest dialogue about mental health with your child. If you notice changes in their sleeping habits or moods or relationship, it's good to talk about these things because these early conversations help pave the way for more difficult conversations. Secondly, parents should talk about suicide directly. You don't want to skirt around the issue, especially if you have seen some potential warning signs. Ask directly, as I had mentioned. There are lots of benefits to engaging in these conversations. One benefit is that they build connectiveness, which is a known protective factor. Connectiveness really refers to the number of people who have meaningful relationships with the youth, such as caring adults. Certainly parents are essential, are very important connection. Often persons who have thoughts of suicide feel as though they've lost control. They feel hopeless and helpless. After all, people have great insights into their needs and should be given the space and tools to help keep themselves safe. Psychotherapy is an important component in the management of suicidal ideation behaviors, and there are many well-documented effective psychotherapies, but I'd like to talk to you about a few of them. Cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, is a form of talking therapy which can be used to treat people with a wide variety of mental health problems. CBT is based on the idea that how we think, cognition, how we feel, how we think, cognition, how we feel, emotion, and how we act, behavior, all interact together. Specifically, our thoughts determine our feelings and our behavior. Therefore, negative and unrealistic thoughts can cause us distress and result in problems. When a person suffers with psychological distress, the way in which they interpret situations becomes skewed, which in turn has a negative help people become aware of when they make negative interpretations and of behavioral patterns, which reinforce distorted thinking. Cognitive behavior therapy has 2 specific forms of evidence-based treatment of suicidality. Cognitive therapy for suicide prevention, or CTSP, is a form of CBT that involves 10 sessions focusing on what is referred to as the suicidal mode. The first sessions identify how the mode gets activated. Final sessions is a relapse prevention protocol, which rehearses through guided imagery exercise what the person can do rather than taking their own life. the CTSP intervention was proven to be effective with a 50% reduction in attempts after a 10-session intervention. A variation is BCBT, or Brief Cognitive Behavior Therapy. BCBT focuses on self-soothing techniques and problem solving. Participants in this type of therapy home kits and a prevention protocol. You may also have heard of dialectic behavior therapy, or DBT, which is a cognitive behavioral treatment approach with two characteristics: the behavioral problem-solving focus blended with an acceptance-based strategy focus and an emphasis on dialectical processes. Dialectical processes refers to the issues involved in treating people with multiple disorders, and to the type of thought processes and behavioral styles used in the treatment strategies. DBT has 5 components, which I won't go over just for time. DBT does involve the balancing behavioral change, problem solving, and emotional regulation with validation, mindfulness, and acceptance. And this evidence-based program was seen to be highly effective in treating people with suicidal thoughts. And then finally, the class is a theoretical framework for suicide-specific assessments and treatment for suicidal risk. It's a flexible approach that can be used across theoretical orientations and disciplines. So just finishing up, I thought it was important to talk to you a little bit about talking to children and youth who have been made aware of a death by suicide. So it's important to give accurate information why people suicide, and mention that suicide is a complex problem. Many people try to focus on or blame for why suicide occurred. So try to find a reason for why it occurred. That's typically not so helpful, as well as don't focus on the method of the suicide. Certainly avoid graphics or details about how the person died, but rather talk about feelings such as anger about how the person died, but rather talk about feelings such as anger and provide reassurance about the range of responses that are available. And young people may feel angry towards either the person they died or others. And such feelings can certainly lead to their confusion and distress. So you want to reassure them that they are not to blame, that they're not to feel angry, or that didn't mean that the person didn't care about them. I'm going to just conclude with saying that there are resources that are available. It can certainly be daunting, but there are a number of websites such as the Canada Suicide Prevention Service, which is available in both French and English, that can lead you to other websites and helpful information. And then here are a few suggestions which may encourage others, support a loved one who is struggling with a mental health issue. Do not use the words commit suicide or successful suicide. Use died by suicide or suicided. Reassure others that it's okay to talk about suicide. Talking about suicide can help elected officials shape policy. Take a suicidal alertness or intervention training, such as Safe Talk or Assist, or there's others. Encourage family, friends, coaches to take and host trainings in the community. Raise funds, host or attend a World Session Prevention Day, or even listen to a webinar. So I'm going to try to very quickly, we just have a few minutes left, see if I can find any questions. Scroll down here. Uh-oh, the people saying. Scroll down here. Uh-oh, the people saying it's choppy, sounds great. And I'm not seeing any questions. A second. Here's one. What if the person says that they don't have thoughts thoughts of suicide, but there are warning signs that there is. Well, in a situation like that, you need to be persistent. You may need to ask others to get involved to gain other people's perspective, and remember that you can't keep a secret. You might need to involve emergency services. And then another person asked, do young people webinar? Please remember that there are future Boost CYAC's webinar in this, and their other series are all being recorded. Have a wonderful day, everybody.